Secondary education covers two phases on the International Standard Classification of Education scale. Level 2 or lower secondary education is considered the second and final phase of basic education. And Level 3 secondary education is the stage before tertiary education. Every country aims to provide basic education, but the systems and terminology remain unique to them. Secondary education typically takes place after 6 years of primary education and is followed by higher education, vocational education or employment. In most countries, secondary education is compulsory, at least until the age of 16. Children typically enter the lower secondary phase around age 11. Compulsory education sometimes extends to age 19. Since 1989, education has been seen as a basic human right for a child. Article 28 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child states that primary education should be free and compulsory, while different forms of secondary education, including general and vocational education, should be available and accessible to every child. The terminology has proved difficult, and there was no universal definition before ISCED divided the period between primary education and university into junior secondary education and upper secondary education. In classical and medieval times, secondary education was provided by the church for the sons of nobility and to boys preparing for universities in the priesthood. As trade required navigational and scientific skills, the church reluctantly expanded the curriculum and widened the intake. With the Reformation, the state wrestled the control of learning from the church. And with Comenius and John Locke, education changed from being repetition of Latin text to building up knowledge in the child. Education was for the few. Up to the middle of the 19th century, secondary schools were organized to satisfy the needs of different social classes, with the laboring classes getting 4 years, the merchant class 5 years, and the elite getting 7 years. The rights to a secondary education were codified after 1945. And some countries are moving to mandatory and free secondary education for all youth under 19. Secondary education is in most countries the phase in the education continuum responsible for the development of the young during their adolescence, the most rapid phase of their physical, mental and emotional growth. It is at this very education level, particularly in its first cycle, where values and attitudes formed at primary school are more firmly ingrained alongside the acquisition of knowledge and skills. The 1997 International Standard Classification of Education describes 7 levels that can be used to compare education internationally. Within a country, these can be implemented in different ways, with different age levels and local denominations. The 7 levels are, within this system, levels 1 and 2, that is, primary education and lower secondary together form basic education. Beyond that, national governments may attach the label of secondary education to levels 2 through 4 together, levels 2 and 3 together, or level 2 alone. These level definitions were put together for statistical purposes, and to allow the gathering of comparative data nationally and internationally. They were approved by the UNESCO General Conference at its 29th session in November 1997. Though they may be dated, they do provide a universal set of definitions and remain unchanged in the 2011 update. The start of lower secondary education is characterized by the transition from the single-class teacher, who delivers all content to a cohort of pupils, to one where content is delivered by a series of subject specialists. Its educational aim is to complete provision of basic education and to lay the foundations for lifelong learning. Lower secondary education is likely to show these criteria. The end of lower secondary education often coincides with the end of compulsory education in countries where that exists. Secondary education starts on the completion of basic education, which also is defined as completion of lower secondary education. The educational focus is varied according to the student's interests and future direction. Education at this level is usually voluntary. Secondary education is likely to show these criteria. More subjects may be dropped, and increased specialism occurs. Completion of secondary education provides the entry requirements to level 5 tertiary education. the entry requirements to technical or vocational education, or direct entry into the workplace. In 2012, the ISCED published further work on education levels where it codified particular paths and redefined the tertiary levels. Lower secondary education and secondary education could last between 2 and 5 years. And the transition between two often would be when students were allowed some subject choice. Terminology for secondary schools varies by country, and the exact meaning of any of these varies. Secondary SC